Hi, welcome back to another Slinger video. Today we're going to be assembling the Y-axis, including epoxy and the carbon fibre frame together. Let's get going. So, the first thing we need to pay attention to here is to ensure our carriages are the correct way around. These are going to be epoxied together and there will be no removing them after that. So we need to make sure that this lower piece aligns with this lower piece, not the one with the notch. This will be bonded on top, like so, and the belt will loop through. It's probably a good idea here to use some kind of marker. So I use this silver Sharpie to just make a mark on the top of both of these pieces, so I know that that corner will be bonded with those facing up. One of the first things we need to do is to take off any sharp edges around these. This will stop the belt getting cut. I'm just using a little nail file, and we just want to take the edge away. And that's it. You don't need to do a lot. You can see there's just a little bit to round over that edge. The next thing I would recommend doing is getting some hardware. I'm using some spare M3x8 screws and nuts. And what we're going to do is we're going to cover all of these threads in Vaseline. And what that will do is stop the epoxy resin from sticking to these and bonding them permanently into the carbon fibre. Another thing we're going to want to do is to scuff up this surface and the lower surface of this one. What you could do here is place these on top of where they will be bonded, and you could mark out and simply just scuff up the surface that will be visible. However, this is going to be under the bed and you're never going to see this, so I'm simply going to scuff the top of this one and the bottom of this one. That way everything that needs to be scuffed is scuffed. I'm just using a piece of sandpaper, which is actually a sanding disc. And as you can probably see there, it's added a nice scratched surface to the top of there. Wouldn't want to do that to the nice carbon fibre, but for here it makes sense. And so just make sure we get a nice bond between those two layers. So now the epoxy resin generally has a 5-minute curing time, and after that 5 minutes it's no longer usable. So we need to make sure we have everything ready, including all of our hardware, Vaseline and some clamps, and everything ready to just go. So what I'm going to do now quickly is clean up the working area and then clean these parts with some IPA or isopropyl alcohol. Most importantly is this side that we're going to be gluing. I recommend a good helping of IPA to remove any bits of carbon dust. As you can see, there's quite the amount on there that would affect the bonding. And then we'll use the clean side just to make sure that's all nice and clean. And we'll do the same on this part. And those are ready to bond. Now, I don't recommend touching this because the grease off your fingers may affect it. So, handling these by the edges, I'm just going to set those aside for a moment and then clean down the work area of any carbon dust. Realistically, you should wear a respirator when doing this. Carbon is nasty stuff. Don't want to breathe that in. At this point, it probably would make sense to trace your outline. Now, what I'm going to do is apply my carbon to the bottom of this piece. So if we flip this over and align the screw holes, we can then see where the carbon overlaps. I'm just going to make some small lines. Obviously will be left, but we want to epoxy as much of this as possible. So the way I'm going to do that is using a small paintbrush, or rather a large, it's just a kid's paintbrush with hard nylon, and we're using JB Weld. This is high heat resistant, up to 232 degrees. And we'll add, of course, that whatever you use to mix this stuff will be rubbish, and you won't be able to reuse it. So I'm going to add probably way more than we need there. And we have a nice resealable tube. Okay, so we have 5 minutes working time. So we need to mix this until it's consistent all the way through in colour. We don't want any black or white in there. We want it all to be this nice dark grey. And at this point, it's ready to begin spreading. So we need to work relatively quickly here, and this is where the paintbrush comes in handy. We want to spread this out, not too thinly, but enough that it's got a good bit that could be squeeged. And that's done. And using my cloth with the IPA from earlier, I'm going to clean this up, because any of this that gets onto your work area will be there forever. And I probably should have done this in the first place and put down a cloth. Okay, so as you can see, that's all I've done. And I'm going to double check the diagram, and we want our notch to the open side. So attempt to get this down in the correct place first time. And there we go. And that is where it will live for all eternity. And now we need to begin rather quickly adding the screws and hardware to try and keep this nice and square and obviously together. So I'm going for squareness first. And now at this point, we'll add some clamps to just spread the weight evenly. A few different kinds that should hold nicely. These are quite high strength clamps, sorry. I see a little splooge here of the epoxy resin, and I don't want that on my clamps or in the screw holes really. So what I'm going to do is, using a sacrificial screw, we'll try and poke some of that through. And it'll just make it easier than trying to drill those with resin in them at a later stage. This one says that you have your working time of 5 minutes, and then set in 4 to 6 hours. So what we're going to do, move this aside. I'm obviously going to suspend it above a piece of towel because I don't want it to drip anywhere. So I'll set that aside and then we'll move on to some of the other components. So that's one job down. I'd like to say that was the messy job down, but unfortunately we still have to grease our linear rails, which is where we'll go next. And to do this, I found this huge syringe on Amazon. It's way bigger than we need for this. So I'm just going to put a load of this into here. And it should make the job easier and less messy. That'll be more than enough for all of our rails. Now, as always with new linear rails, we want to put them into soak. And the reason for that is that there's machine oil and all kinds of manufacturing grease in these, and it's not the kind of grease that we need to keep them in top condition. Now, if you don't do this, then although they run relatively smooth, they will not last. So what I like to do is make sure they'll go all the way to the end, and we're just going to soak them in a glass of IPA. You can print a bath that they lie in and then run it backwards and forwards. However, I haven't done that for reasons unknown. I usually do, but I don't have one big enough for these rails. So what we'll do is we'll put these in the glass of IPA. Put them there because the weight of the rails will pull them. And this is 99% pure alcohol. And we just want to make sure that it goes just above the top of the carriages. And we want to leave that for about 10 minutes. After about 10 minutes, we'll flip them over, run the rails up and down, and then give them a wipe down, and then they'll be ready to grease. So we'll be back shortly. There's 5 minutes there. I'm going to take these out, move them around a little. So I just want to run them up and down. And the reason for that is just to get all the ball bearings spinning inside the carriage. You want to get as much of this IPA as possible behind those ball bearings and anything that was in there before out. And we'll leave it at the opposite end this time and drop it back in the liquid. And the same again for this one. And we'll leave them for another 5 minutes. And now we just want to take these out. You can leave one in there whilst we're dealing with the first one. And the first thing we're going to want to do is just rub these down. We don't want IPA everywhere. It just makes us have a nice clean surface ready to start working with. And it just makes sure that there's no grease left from the manufacturing process. And obviously make sure you go down the channels at the sides. And we're done. Now, there are a few ways to grease these rails. One way, and the correct way that the likes of Highwind would recommend, is to use a small syringe with a needle tip and inject through the sides of the block. However, I have found that I've had to do that many times to actually reach the centre of the balls. However, what I prefer to do is to grease from the back, and this is how we'll do that. So we'll move back to the overhead camera for this. Now, before you start doing this, make sure you have some paper towels. I like to get a few cotton buds as well. It's been helpful to clear out the holes. So what we're going to do is take our syringe and we're going to place it directly above the hole. It probably won't fit through the hole, however this is close enough. If you try and make a good seal, then just squeeze in the grease. And what we want to do is squeeze until we see it appear at the sides. If you see there, the grease is now oozing out just slightly, and we want that to happen all the way along. So what we do here is to simply keep going and whilst it's oozing out, slowly move the carriage along the rail and back and forth. At this point, I like to just remove any excess just to stop it spreading. And this is a very wasteful process, unfortunately, but it needs to be done to keep your rails nice and healthy. And at this point, just move your rail backwards and forwards quite a bit. And it's not uncommon for it to start feeling a little more notchy than it was before, whilst the grease makes its way into all of the different ball bearings. And then what we do is go back to the beginning and repeat that process, making sure to go all the way backwards and forwards, moving the carriage across to the next one, going again. Now again, this is quite a wasteful process, however it's definitely worth it for how long your rails will last and how much smoother they'll run. And once again, just wipe down some of the excess. There's no way to do this job that's nice and clean, but as you can probably hear already, that is now running significantly smoother, it's tighter, and I can feel the notches starting to disappear already. Now at this point, some people will say, you want to just sit here going backwards and forwards for the next 10 minutes or so to get rid of the notchiness. You can, but personally I find that just installing it at this point is absolutely fine. Don't expect your first print, if you're not going to move it around, to look perfect. You may have some artifacts from the notches, but they will work themselves out after a small amount of time. So then at this point we just clean up any remaining grease that's in the sides of the rails, because we don't want this all over our printer. We also don't want to leave the grease on the rail. Now, I have heard some people like to grease the actual rail themselves. However, grease attracts an awful lot of dirt, and any dust that's anywhere near your printer will end up on your rails, stuck to the grease, and inevitably end up inside your blocks. And that's not a good thing. There is no way that that doesn't end badly. So this is where little cotton buds come in useful, because we can simply poke any remaining grease out from the other side. And remove that as much as possible. You probably won't be able to get it all out of these holes, they're quite deep, but we just want to get the majority away to make it nice and clean. One thing I find helps at times is just pull the bud off the end of the cotton stick and just push through anything that's left in the holes, because we don't want that, because the bits that are way down there will inevitably end up on our screw threads, which we're going to want to thread lock. And one final wipe down. You can add a bit of IPA for this if you wish. And obviously always reinstall the blockers just to stop it from going over the end, because that would be a bad day, especially with preloaded rails. They're quite difficult to get the balls back in. And there is one rail, prepped and greased, ready to be installed. So, I'll do the other one, which is just a repeat. I'll be back in just a few moments. You may be able to see here the amount of grime that's in the bottom of that glass. Now, this was brand new IPA and a clean glass. And that is just some of the grime that's come out of those rails. So that will be disposed of. And it makes good sense at this point to go and wash your hands, because this grease gets everywhere, and when you start touching these black extrusions, the fingerprints will be wild. Now that the messy work is out of the way, let's get started on the actual assembly. The closest way I see to do this is by referring to the CAD model. And what I've done is exploded this out so that we can see what we need. So I've already got my printed parts ready, and as you can see here, we have this one, and this one. Now there are a few heat press inserts to install here, as you can see probably see on the manual here. What we can do is add a sectional analysis and simply move this backwards until we find what we're looking for. What we want to do is find where those heat press inserts go. And there they are. So what we'll want to do is install our heat press insert here and one here. And I do believe these are the longer ones that we need to install. We can find this by moving back and selecting the component. Just by clicking there, we have heat insert M3 long. So we'll need 2 of those, and we'll need 2 for the other side. So we'll do that now. We simply push these where they need to be, double checking that they will fit. And what I like to do here is not apply too much pressure to these, and just let the heat and gravity take them in. And then obviously, as we don't want any kind of overspill on top of there, use something flat, such as a spare piece of extrusion, to get yourself a nice flat surface on top. And it's quite common for there to be a bit of overspill on the back. It's not a big deal. We can just go in and knock that out with a blade after. So that's one, and the other goes on this side. Now, at this point, we're just going to carry on going through this section and deciding where we go next. So we have, of course, a stepper motor here. We have the pulley for the stepper motor, and a pulley and a pin. And appears there's a shim there as well. So 7 by 5 by 0.5. Handily there on top. I would assume there'd be one on both sides, and yes, there is. So we'll need 2 of those, and we will need 625 bearing, which are these ones you see here, and I'm deliberately ignoring screws at this point, and I do believe that's the end. We will need this small piece of plastic, which is a rail stopper. What we'll want to do here, we'll need to mount our pulley to the stepper motor, obviously making sure that at least one of the grub screws is aligned with the flat spot, and then the bearing simply sits on top. Okay, so these actually fit upside down to how we would usually fit them, and they go this way. There doesn't appear to be any spaces. I like to just remove these and check if there's any thread locker on them, and there's not, so we're going to add some. This is Loctite 248. I prefer it in a tube instead of the paint on. It's just much cleaner. And it doesn't ooze out everywhere. You just need a tiny amount of that on the side of your grub screw. And pound it back in. And we'll do that for both screws. Now it's important to note that Loctite breaks down ABS, or the chemical compounds within ABS, so you can only use this on parts that are metal on metal. And using a little cloth, just wipe away any excess. Again, we don't want that making its way onto our ABS components. Now, we also know that this bearing needs to sit in the top of here. It should be a nice flat fit. And you should be able to see that from the other side. And when our stepper motor is in place, that will sit within that bearing and prevent any movement. The main screw here will be an M3 by 30. And that's a socket head screw that we'd like. So here's the screw we're going to need. And that's where it will go. At this point, we need to assemble our upper bearing. So I think the idea here would be best to install the pin in this side at the same time as installing your bearing. And we have our shim, our idler, and another shim. At this point, these can be pulled together like so. And then, using the heat press insert we installed earlier, we can fix these three parts together. And there we have our idler, our bearing, and of course we can now see how this is going to fit to the end of the profile. However, at this point I wouldn't recommend installing the stepper motor. As you can see here, this will obstruct access to this fastener. So this will need to be installed to the extrusion at this point. There is also an M3 by 45mm screw that will go in the bottom of here. This is also a socket head screw, and this will tie all three of these components together. Of course, making sure not to over tighten these as they're screwing into plastic components and will strip quite easily. At the end of your profile should already be tapped at this point. If you bought the Fysetc kit like I did, you'll have your holes already tapped and ready to go. And that will simply go like so. At this point we can simply check what size. And we have M8 by 16. And I do believe they'll be the same at both ends. They are indeed. And I have them already here. A lot of people would say don't use thread lock, and simply because it's going up against ABS parts. However, as we have access to the back of these, I'm going to use thread lock. And I'm going to add it just to the back. Being careful not to get that anywhere near the ABS. Just a small amount. On both of those screws. Again, making sure not to get it near the ABS. And that is how this installs. As you can see, it's fully installed at the end of there now. Now there will be two additional screws, fixtures that go into the bottom, but we don't need to worry about those for the moment. At those two lower holes, sorry, are actually for the feet. So we'll want to install them. And we'll need two 30 M5 T-nuts to do so. You can install these simply by dropping them into the end of the extrusion. And at this point, I think it's actually more sensible to install the other end to stop anything falling away. So we'll set that aside, and we'll bring over those components too. We actually need to preload our linear rail screws, nuts, sorry. So we can remove one end of this again. Okay, and it looks like we need 12 M3 T-nuts. So we'll need this little end stop, or the end bumper. And a screwdriver. And we'll pull that right to the back for the time being and just wind that in. So flipping it over will be the reverse. We can install the opposite end, and that will hold all of those in there and stop any further issues. We're going to install our feet. And again, using the section analysis tool, we can see exactly what we need here. So we'll need an M5 35mm socket head, and the kit comes with 5 of those. So we'll need some M5 hex nuts, and we'll need 8 of those, 4 of which will go into these little discs, and they simply push into there. Next we'll take our feet with our M5 screw, followed by the ring with the nut facing upwards, another M5 nut, and then simply install. What I like to do here is use any X key, check from above until that lines up, and there we can see that fit nicely. And the next 3. And that's our feet installed. That should then sit nicely on those feet. Now I'm not going to worry about trying to align them just yet. And next I'm going to look at installing our linear rails. So we have 12 holes, and those are M3 by 12, and all of which we'll be using thread lock. So M3 by 12 socket head screws. It's important to note that we don't want to tighten anything here. We just want to cinch it down slightly to hold it still, because there will be tools that will assist us with the tightening. One way I like to do this is to make sure that all of our T-nuts are at the one end. And then and back, and then simply move off them and back in and clip the next one. And provided you printed the tools when you printed your printer kit, that is what we'll use to ensure that this is central on our extrusion, and that is an extremely important part. If it's not, it won't run smoothly. And remember in there that your carriage is extremely vulnerable should it go off the end. These are two of your tool components, and these simply clip over your rail, and they will pull them central on our extrusion and ensure that that rail stays perfectly in centre. So that's what we want to do next. We'll push our rail to where we need it, up against the bump stop, and then begin tightening. I need to ensure that the end stop replaces this one. And at this point, this end stop will be installed. These are designed in such a way that the wires are fed through before they're soldered. And our Fysetc kit comes pre-soldered. So what we're going to have to do here is desolder these and refit them. So we'll come back to that later. We'll set that aside for now. And we'll simply install the plastic component to keep our rail nice and safe. This is a nice part of the kit that's quite easily removed, so it's not a big deal to have that there, ready and waiting. I'm going to place the other rail, the other bump stop on this side to keep this one safe. And this will be our third and final stopper. And that holds our rails nice and captive and prevents them from ever wandering off the front of the carriages. As you may have seen in episode 1, we used our M3x35 screws for our fans. Turns out we do actually need those for our stepper motors. Fortunately, I have a good supply of these. Unfortunately, they're a different colour. So, at this point, we can install our stepper motors. Now the Y-axis takes some of the larger motors, and these simply slide in from below. We want to make sure our connector is on the bottom as per the CAD model. Then we use the M3x35 screws, go through this plastic component, and an M3x30. We can do the same on this side. However, the stepper motor is on the opposite corner. And this one is here, and this side is here. Again, with the power connector facing down. And that concludes this section. As you can see, the belt paths, the belts will run through here and around our pulleys, which I forgot to install on that side. We still need to install our carriages. These will install here and here. So these will be M3x12 button head screws, and they'll screw directly into the sides. However, we need to ensure the ends of these are flat. And we do this with our sandpaper from earlier. And the reason for these screws is just to hold them together and give us a nice, perfectly flat finish between the two. And these will install directly to our carriages here. Again with M3x12 button head screws this time. Now obviously our bed carriage from earlier will go on top of here and the heated bed above that. However, that takes up to 16 hours to cure. So we'll come back to this in the morning. Okay, for our carriage blocks we'll need to install 3 of the long heat press inserts. I do this by installing 3 of the longer screws from the other side. This just helps keep them nice and straight. And don't push the screw all the way through because it will absorb a lot of the heat. And simply reinstall those carriage blocks as we did before. Now, with the clamps removed, we're going to want to clear out some space in these holes. I'm simply running a 3mm drill bit through the holes. It's important to note that I'm not actually drilling into the carbon fibre here, just moving the epoxy out of the way. And this will just make the screws go through there nice and easily. At this point we can attach the carriage. The 2 screws in the middle are 35mm button head screws. And the 2 outer screws are 30mm button head screws. Push those down and tighten them down slightly. They don't need to be completely tight at this stage. As per the manual, we'll want to loosen the 3 screws on the right. And we'll do this looking at the machine from the front. And gently move it back and forward. This will allow us to auto align the carriage against that rail. And gradually tighten down these 3 screws. They're just like a quarter turn at a time. This will prevent any warping of the frame. Don't tighten down the middle one before the outer ones. And just move backwards and forwards, gradually tightening that down until it runs nice and smooth. We'll need to do the same on the side to auto align against the carriage blocks. And we'll simply slacken these screws and do exactly the same procedure, moving backwards and forwards, allowing that carriage to auto align. Now it makes sense to tighten these in a crisscross pattern, so corner to corner. It just helps keep things nice and square. Ensuring that you have your spaces in place. Tighten down the 4 corners. Don't need to be over tightened, but they should be relatively tight. You'll need to apply 2 small cable ties to the strain relief at the back of the bed. There are channels in the printed strain relief where the cable ties will sit. And now the oh so satisfying peel, revealing that beautiful carbon fibre bed. Next we'll add the Y end stop switch. We need to remove this plastic component and then desolder the switch. Feed the 2 wires through the plastic component, cut them to length and strip the end of the cables. It helps to pre-tin the ends of these cables and apply some extra solder to the end of the end stop switch. And then simply solder the cables to the switch. You'll need to solder on the 2 outer pins. The orientation doesn't matter. Check that you have a solid solder joint Then push the cables back through the plastic component, pushing the end stop switch until it's flush with the edge of the component. This can be a little tricky. And now we'll want two M2x8 screws. These don't go particularly tight, just enough to hold everything in place. And then we can reattach it to our Y-axis. Simply put it in place and ensure that it's snugged up against the end of the rail. Check for the audible click while moving the bed backwards. You should hear the end stop activate. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Join me next time when we'll assemble the Z-axis. As a disclaimer, this kit was provided free of charge by Fysetc for research and review purposes. However, they have no input in the outcome of this or any videos on the channel, and will not see this video before you. Thank you for watching, and if you don't want to miss the next leg of our Slinger journey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, and I welcome your comments and feedback on the videos and projects. If you want to get your own LH Slinger kit, you can find them at the links in the video description, as well as several useful resources such as the LH Slinger GitHub and Git Discord server. I want to thank Lima Hayes, the creator of the LH Slinger, for his cooperation and guidance, and our official filament sponsor, Filamentive, who have provided us with a huge batch of filament for this and many of our next projects.